This new ecosystem of gacha games has really overtaken the current gaming industry by the neck. And I guess it's not really a surprise then, or even a wonder, that these games specifically have become some of the most grossing compared to even big budget AAA games. Hoyoverse is just one of these newly founded companies focused purely on this rather new gaming ecosystem, greatly known for their incredibly successful game, Genshin Impact. We are now standing in front of the next new installment, Honkai Star Rail, taking a bit from Genshin, but I think moving me more away from that to do its own thing. And while I've never been a big fan of gachas in their own right, Star Rail is different. It's now been close to 4 months now since its initial release, and I'm still as addicted as I was in the beginning, and I want to figure out why. Why did a gacha turn-based RPG hook me this hard? Well, let's figure that out. Now, as you may or may not know, I'm a huge fan of narratively driven games, something like Persona 5, which, in case you haven't seen my almost 2-hour analysis of it, I highly recommend you do after this video. It took a ton of work and I would greatly appreciate it just checking it out. Anyways, back on track, Star Rail does something much different and greatly better than other gacha games, and that's how it hooks the player. Now, many other gacha games kind of do the same thing these days, slowly involve the player into the mechanics of the game and try to get the player interested with the story. However, many gacha games really fall flat in terms of this, especially with the story. Yet Star Rail honestly has a great hook in both how the story develops and its own combat, and that's really what got me hooked, with how surprisingly good the beginning part of the game was. But it really wasn't until the second planet that I became addicted. Now, I really don't want to spoil anything, but if you play through the second planet, then I think you understand what I'm talking about. And I think that is really when I understood what makes this game to me a bit above other gacha. It is just seriously that well done in terms of basically every part of it. And I try not to say that very lightly either. I'm a pretty critical person, especially when it comes to stories. But what Star Rail has done was something that I really just didn't expect in a mobile phone game. The characters were surprisingly deep, especially more so in the specific companion missions that I just really wasn't expecting. The rather dark consequences and the themes that were portrayed throughout the second planet, it was just simply well done. And I hope I don't come off as a slop glopper for this game. And don't worry, I will definitely be getting into more of the problems it has, but I think in terms of story, it's just really well done and fun to engage with. The story isn't everything this game has to offer, and while it's by far one of the central focuses of the game, and that's definitely what I like most about it, you're definitely not going to be experiencing it for the most of the time you're going to be playing. The gameplay is really what this game is about, and it's, I think, a rather interesting topic to talk about. And it's more so something I really wasn't expecting I would like as much as I do at this moment, especially with how long I've been playing now. The gameplay of Star Rail is rather simplistic in terms of other turn-based RPGs, where you really only have 2 buttons plus an ultimate ability once you've built it up. Already you might be thinking that this is quite simplistic, or very simplistic even. And while there is some more depth to the gameplay and the enemies you engage with that I will briefly jump into, I think it's the simplicity that this game has to offer that makes it a fun and good experience. Much of the early criticisms I saw of this game was about the game's combat, and was due to the simplistic nature of it. And while I can understand why someone would want more or just doesn't enjoy these type of games, I think there's something they missed that makes it click. As complexity isn't what makes a good combat system good, it just simply makes it more complex. What makes a combat system fun and engaging comes down to a multitude of different factors, but I think more specifically in terms of Star Rail, it's the simplicity and how it works together, and instead of the combat itself creating an interesting and unique experience, it's the gameplay modes and scenarios that create the more complex and interesting moments. You might completely disagree, and that's fine, but Star Rail's combat flows really well together and allows a really fun and fluid way to play that is just pleasing to engage with most of the time. Instead of a more complex system, which especially more so for a gacha phone game, would kind of ruin the fluid nature the combat has and would just become kind of a slog really fast. The skill point system, which is just the core of the combat, offers that level where you really don't need to worry about it until it starts to really matter. Well then, there is a skill level of learning the best way to use these skill points in the more possible best way. It's really not that complex, but I think it can be utilized fully to its potential. I find a lot more fun and strategy otherwise that I think wouldn't be found if the system didn't exist. What makes the gameplay of Star Rail work is both, again, how it respects your own time and a couple of different ways they involve you in the combat. For the first one, you don't really have to engage yourself at all times with the combat, which can definitely become more of a slog when you're grinding out different materials for characters all the time. Instead, just allowing the game to play itself, which in theory is kind of weird and not a really great design choice, but I think for the gacha game that this is, it makes the daily and weekly process of playing the game and grinding it out much more bearable, and it becomes harder to get burnt out. which is a very important thing for a gacha game. And then we get to the different gameplay scenarios, and this is really where the game shines for me, especially so in the simulated universe. Think of it as like a roguelike experience in which you go through different tiers and floors attaining different abilities and buffs throughout that can change how you play compared to a normal scenario. Something like a dot run or damage over time, also called nihility in the game, is not entirely worthwhile to do so right now, outside of that, as we just don't have the characters right now to make it fun and worthwhile. While in the simulated universe, however, the dot or nihility run is one of the more fun and interesting ways to play the game. It can really show how fun dots can be, with it being fully focused on that specific type of gameplay and what it can do. And if you don't want to involve yourself with that, you don't have to. There are plenty of different paths that you can go down to that change the way you play in the simulated universe. So far, I found each one offers a pretty fun and unique way to engage the game in a much more extreme way. I honestly mean this when I say the simulated universe is possibly one of my most favorite pieces of content from a gacha I've ever played. Much more so, but one that is a weekly event. And then you have these new events coming every so often that can add some unique ways you are forced to play. It keeps the game varied and interesting, which is what it needs to be to keep players engaged with its rather simplistic combat system. And then lastly are the different types of enemies and the combat scenarios that are involved with them. Some can be very interesting, especially the robot type enemies, but more times than not I find them to be more interesting than just a normal enemy that you have to kill. It offers more interesting ways to involve yourself with the game. Now that I've really talked about the core part of the gameplay, I think it's now worthwhile to talk about some of the other parts of the gameplay and how those are affected by how the combat is played. First and foremost are the characters, which are a bit different, I would say, compared to a more normal RPG style. Instead, these characters are fixated on what they can do. It's pretty more in line with how a gacha game would work than an RPG. For example, Sela is focused on doing insane single target damage, and her abilities and passes are core to her character. You can't just change them. Instead, you can upgrade them along the way, improving them further along, which then can become the main part of the grinding in this game. The grinding in this game really is just focused on upgrading the power of your characters, through upgrading their abilities, leveling them, and their gear. Gear is quite possibly the worst thing ever. I fucking hate it, but it's what makes it the game interesting for the long period of time. But I'll get to that later. Characters are really what add the different elements and abilities into the game. With the addition of new characters, they can offer new ways to play a certain class. Recently, with the addition of Locha, the newest healer, he offers a new way of healing instead of the more basic way previous characters have done. Instead of it being a more involved process of healing of using a skill point, etc., Locha instead is based on an auto-healing and a charge-esque system. To not bore you with the details, Locha needs to gain 2 charges to enable a healing field that allows all your characters to be healed when they do damage, propagating towards everyone in the party. Every time he heals, he gains a charge. And with the power of the auto-heal, you can see how this becomes a really interesting and really broken character, and offers a more fun way to heal compared to previous characters. Now that we talked about how characters are a major part of the gameplay system and how that specific system works in brief detail, next comes into play is lycones, or more simply weapons, and relics, or more simply gear. These are what add more to the abilities of a character, granting more buffs that can change based on how good a specific light cone or piece of gear is. Light cones are the more straightforward element in the system, as they offer much more powerful and more straightforward buff, while relics or gear are really what give character specific stats, with something as simple as attack percentage, to crit rate or crit damage, doing more specific types of elemental damage, to even increasing the outgoing healing. The gearing system is where the more the complex systems work, and more so because of how terrible this game is at explaining what stats do, but more so how we're supposed to play into them. Giving something like a healing increase to a DPS will do basically nothing, especially if they don't play into that, while giving a crit rate main piece to a DPS will do a lot more. And then you also have to focus on the abilities a character plays into, and the stats they focus on. The best example I can think of right now is Zhang Jing, a 5-star Ice Hunt character that plays off crit in a different way than most other characters. Instead of usually trying to balance crit rate and crit damage in a way that allows the greatest opportunity for a crit to the damage output, instead Yang Jing plays a lot more into crit damage due to how his abilities and passives work. He gives himself a rather insane amount of crit rate, both in his talent, which is part of his character's kit, and his ultimate, that at the end of the day makes him a much more interesting character that plays a lot more into crit damage than crit rate, as going over 100% crit rate is completely useless when you could be putting that into crit damage. Overall, I completely find the gearing system to be the most annoying bullshit I've ever seen in a gacha game, but it also is what the end game is. Rolling for better and better gear to reach that point where you can clean the end game content like Memory of Chaos, similar to the Spiral Abyss in Genshin. But as I haven't played Genshin, This is my first time experiencing that. I have played Genshin, I just think it's kind of a bad game. But if you haven't played it before, think of it as like a bi-weekly series of a pretty extremely difficult pieces of content that forces you to play into that structure for that week and the different elements of the enemy. But I could talk more about how the gameplay works, but I feel like I would just be a broken record at that point. The gameplay of Star Rail at the end of the day is just really solid. I wouldn't call it the best gameplay system, but I think I could call it good or even great. And that, for an anime mobile gacha game, quite a good thing. Honestly, I'm just shocked that I could say this about an anime phone game, but here we are, I guess. Star Rail is honestly one of my favorite games to release this year, which is just even more insane to me compared to how many good games we've gotten this year so far. Yet, it's still a gacha game, and that will always be what makes it a rather terrible game at the end of the day. Not from how well the content is, because I think I've pointed out that it's really rather well done on all fronts. Instead, a gacha game is focused on preying on the people that shouldn't be preyed upon. I'm not really going to shy away from how a gacha game has ruined people's lives, and even though I spent a little amount of money on this game, I will not lie, I keep it very low. It's just how predatory these games can be. And I think that's what always will hold this game back from being a good game and one that I can recommend. I think the game has enough really well done content that it can be continually engaging and interesting to engage with. But these types of games have ruined people's lives as much as gambling has. As at the end of the day, they're really just fundamentally the same thing. You're rolling for characters that you can spend money on to get more roll. Nothing all too dissimilar to how a slot machine works, but with hot anime waifus and husbandos. Like, there's really not much of a difference. I don't think I could recommend this game if I just didn't talk about how disgusting these types of games can be at the end of the day. So really, seriously, please be careful about spending money on these types of games. Please only spend what you're able to, and better yet, don't spend it all. You can play this game perfectly as a free-to-play player and have a great time. I sure as hell did for basically the entire game until I spent. I'm not here to tell you how you shouldn't or should do what you want to do, but just be careful and especially mindful when playing these types of games. It's a very easy pit to fall into and a hell of a hard one to come back from. I like Star Rail. Hell, I might even say I love it. I love the characters, the stories, and just being in the world itself. It offers a great time for what is basically a free price of admission. Yet, a gacha game will always be a gacha game, and that will never change. But I think we can still sort of appreciate Star Rail for what it is and what it's done, while being mindful of the nature it has and the company behind it. I really like Star Rail, but a gacha game will always be a gacha game.